Alright, hey guys, welcome back to another Realm of the Mad God video, and today I'm going to be talking about the best dungeons you want to farm for each stat potion. It's safe to say there's a greater abundance of pots in the game because of how many dungeons there are, alongside the inclusion of the Tinker quest chest and all that, so seeing a maxed 8-8 character, it's more commonplace than it was back then, where like if you saw an 8-8 grave, it was, a legitimate F in the chat. For some people, it took literal months or even up to a year to work your way towards that. That being said, I know there still are a lot of players who are looking for an easy and streamlined way to grab potions, and so I figured it's a good time to make this video. There are 8 stat potions in the game that you need to collect after reaching level 20. Life, mana, attack, defense, speed, dexterity, vitality, and wisdom. The usual priority for maxing a character if you're going at it the conventional route is to nail dexterity and defense first, the double Ds. Mostly because the former is really easy to farm and it's the more accessible of the two offensive stats, and defense is because you desperately need it to not get one-shotted by everything. After that, you can really go about it however you want, but usually the last 2 stats to max out are life and mana, given that there are the rarest to find. I'm using rarest really loosely because nowadays it's a lot easier to get back then, and in fact I would argue that in some cases it is much easier to max out life and mana before any of the other 6. So starting with dexterity, here's a list of every dungeon that drops them at a decent amount. We have Sprite World, of course, the original Dex Pot dungeon, Deadwater Docks, Magic Woods, and the Nest. Those are like the 4 main ones that drop Dex. Despite it being one of the earliest accessible potions in the game, it just so happens to be the one that drops in a very few amount of dungeons, funnily enough. Only reason it is so plentiful is because Sprite Worlds are plentiful, but Magic Woods and Sprite World, they are your 2 easiest sources of Dex. But an underrated source of Dex, I think, is Deadwater Docks. D-Docks is one of the most commonly popped dungeons by way of keys, and it can drop up to 2 Dex per run, one from Treasure Room and one from the boss. But if you happen to be willing to take on a lot of danger, the Nest is bar none the greatest source of Dex pots in the game in terms of potential yield per run. Each of the Soldier Bees has a chance to drop Dex, the Behemoths that spawn with the Queen Bee can drop Dex, and the Queen Bee herself can not only drop Dex pots, but greater Dex pots. I think the highest amount of Dex I've gotten in like a single nest was 7 or something. It was ridiculous. So high risk, high reward if you just want to run a nest at 0-8 for the sake of either because you're good at the game or YOLO purposes. D-Docks and Nest are also 2 dungeons that have events running pretty frequently, so if there ever happens to be one that's running, definitely capitalize on it. I know there are other places you can get Dex like Ice Cave and Haunted Cemetery, but those don't drop them as frequently right now. The point of this video is to show you the dungeons in particular, not necessarily enemies, that can give you a main source or access to a certain stat. Defense comes next. Now, defense is one of those stats that take the longest to max, given that every character needs at least 25, with knights needing 40, so if you're playing a knight, good luck with that. But fortunately, defense drops come from almost every enemy under the sun. But we're talking mainly dungeons, so let's get to it. Thing is, the main dungeon that drops defense is the Toxic Sewers. That's about it. The thing with defense is that while you can get defense pots basically anywhere, there's not really a specific dungeon that specializes in it. It's sort of like a secondary drop for every other dungeon. For example, Abyss of Demons and Sprite World both have a chance to drop defense, but that's not their primary potion. Even the Mad Lab, while it has a guaranteed defense potion drop, that only comes from the second boss, which not everyone does. There is one dungeon that does consistently yield a defense pot every time, but it isn't exactly a safe place to farm for it, given that you either need to be decked out with equipment or very experienced in the dungeon, and if you are, chances are this video doesn't really apply to you. The Marble Colossus in the Lost Halls does yield a consistent defense and attack pot if you get all the way to the end, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you're looking for a fun challenge, because then in that case you would have to run 25 to 40 Lost Halls to max your character. That being said, just about every dungeon in the game drops defense as some form of component drop, such as Ivory Wyvern in Lair of Draconis, Janus and Oryx from Oryx's Castle, Puppet Master's Encore, the Treasure Sarks in Tomb of the Ancients, Forgotten Sentinel and Shatters, just to name a few. But back to the Toxic Sewers though. Even that is not too enjoyable of a dungeon given how slow paced it is unless you have a rusher, but that's practically the only dungeon in the game whose primary stat pot is defense. If you're playing in a group or if you see other players entering the sewers, then definitely join up with them. But otherwise, defense is that one stat that while you do need to max it right away, chances are it may not even be the first or second one, it might be the 3rd or 4th stat you maxed. Which I understand, because since defense is the quote-unquote most valuable stat in the game early on, obviously you don't want to be able to max it out right away. It's just that stat that you gradually max out as you continue playing. Once you cover those two, there is no particular order, like I said, in how you go about maxing other stats. In fact, I actually end up maxing life and mana first before any of the other stats, since I primarily focus on endgame dungeons. So I'll go one point at a time and talk about attack next. Attack pots are similar to defense in that there's a crap ton of them anywhere in the game, but unlike defense pots, there's actually quite a few consistent sources of attack. The main sources of attack in the Godlands is the Puppet Master's Theater, Manor of Immortals, and also the second boss of Cursed Library. Outside of that, we have the Woodland Labyrinth, a dungeon rich with vitality, attack, and life, and I find attack to be equally plentiful alongside vitality, not to mention, like D-Docks, every woodland is guaranteed to have a treasure room, which gives you 2 chances for pots. One other place I think that can be a viable source of attack, if you have the patience to stay in it for a long time, is the Candyland Hunting Grounds, since almost every boss in there can drop attack. 2 other dungeons that specialize in giving attack pots are Davy Jones' Locker, which I think is pretty underrated, and Lair of Shaitan. Former, I highly recommend you go into every chance you get, since that dungeon is practically a gold mine for good equipment and it gives attack and wisdom pots at a fairly equal amount. And as for Shaitan's, I don't recommend it. Shaitan's is extremely dangerous and it's pretty much the last dungeon you want to go to if you're looking for attack. A lot of people either force Nexus or die there just because of how much death is in your face, and it's generally considered a very hated dungeon, so I would stay away from those. Speed, probably the easiest stat to max in the game, even more so than Dex in my opinion. I say that because the main dungeons that drop speed function similar to Dex, in which it can drop so many of them in a single run. Snake Pit is just as common, maybe a little bit rarer than Sprite World, and also very easy to run, including the possibility of having treasure rooms up to I think 3 or 4. I mentioned D-Docks already with Dex, but since it also drops speed, that is also equally a good place to farm speed for. But there's also one other place I think people don't really give too much credit when it comes to gaining a lot of speed. Haunted Cemetery. While it got reworked to be marginally harder and kind of more tedious, it was made up for it by greatly increasing your chances to get potions, and a lot of them. While Sems can drop every single rainbow stat in the game, being attack, defense, speed, dexterity, vitality, and wisdom, the most common stat is speed. You can get it from all 5 bosses, which means in a single sem, you can get 5 speed potions if you're lucky, and it happens quite often. Apart from that, speed is relatively absent from most late game to end game dungeons since they prioritize attack and defense as their secondary stat drop, but it is really easy to come by speed potions similar to Dex pots just because the few dungeons that do yield speed pots can give generous amounts of them. Vitality, despite being the least valuable stat in the game, is also ironically the hardest one to max if we grade it purely on availability. The only dungeons in the game that consistently drops Vitality is Woodland Labyrinth, Cursed Library, and Abyss of Demons. Now, I understand that's not too bad a selection since Cursed Library is a great dungeon and Woodland is too, but Vitality pots are practically completely absent from any late game or end game dungeons except for those who drop one of the 6 rainbows at random. Most high-level dungeons that drop life or mana are usually supplemented by attack or defense and in rare occasions wisdom, but there is no good late-game source of vitality. So that leaves you just 3 choices. Sadly, just like Toxic Sewers, the Abyss of Demons isn't a dungeon people get along with all too famously since it's really anti-rushy, and while it does have treasure rooms, it's not really easy to find them, and they're usually out of the way given how maze-like the Abyss is. Regardless, while it is the least important stat to max out if you're looking to max a warrior or a knight, just be ready to have to grind a lot of these 3 dungeons since vitality drops practically nowhere consistently enough. Stat number 6 is Wisdom. Wisdom is fortunately a lot more plentiful in terms of its dungeon selection. We have Undead Lair, Cursed Library, Davy Jones' Locker, Mad Lab, and Candyland Hunting Grounds. Since there are 2 Godland dungeons that can readily provide you with wisdom pots, just like attack, you'll be spending most of your time hunting flying brains and ghost gods, but attack and wisdom for some reason go hand in hand with each other since Davies and Sealands both drop attack and wisdom, making them a decent pairing. Wisdom is usually the main stat to max after dexterity and defense if you're playing a class that benefits from high wiz like Sorcerer, Priest, Paladin, and Necromancer. Thankfully, there is a good array of low and mid-level dungeons to give you what you need, but similar to Vitality, there isn't much yield in higher level dungeons. Mana, despite being a pretty expensive potion, has a really consistent yield in mid to high level dungeons, with 6 dungeons that specialize in it. Ocean Trench, Crawling Depths, Parasite Chamber, Ice Cave, Cultist Hideout, and both bosses from the Lost Halls. A good 3 of them are very easy to complete, especially with a decent group, with the other 3 being a lot harder to do. In exchange, they yield massive amounts of fame, so you win no matter what. Before, mana used to be a lot harder to max out, but now with the addition and rework of a bunch of dungeons, it's in my opinion one of the most accessible stat pots in terms of dungeon availability, and by now, you should be between 4-8 and 6-8, which makes most of these dungeons relatively easy to complete now that you're more established into the game. Life pots are the most valuable and used to be the hardest pot to get in the game back when the only dungeon that dropped them were tombs and shatters. But after reworking 2 of the epic dungeons and adding a bunch of new endgame dungeons, it's become almost as easy to max life as it is to max any other stat. Tomb of the Ancients still reigns supreme if we're talking just about the easiest way to farm life, but you can get up to 2 life pots per nest run. T-Docks and Woodlands can also drop up to 2 life at a fairly good chance now, and of course with all 3 bosses of the Lost Halls can drop up to 2 life pots each. With how accessible late game dungeons are thanks to raiding discords, you can very safely farm these bosses over and over again given proper vigilance and caution. It should also be mentioned that collecting marks from any of these dungeons can be exchanged for quest chests from the Tinkerer, with the mighty and epic chests being able to yield ridiculous amounts of every potion in the game. Those of you who watch my chest opening videos, you know that I can get about enough potions to max out a character all the way to 8-8, so the proof is kind of in the pudding there. But yeah, farming stat potions, it's never been easier with a ton more options to choose from. All the same, that doesn't mean people don't struggle with maxing a character, because while there are more stat pots you can get in the game, there's also a lot more ways to die in the game. Hope you enjoyed watching though. If you feel like I've missed something for any of these stat pots, please let me know in the comment section below so other viewers can see them. Also, if you would like to leave a like on the video if you found it helpful or entertaining, that'd be appreciated. But for now, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon in the next video. Take care.